ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back once again to the Economancer. Today, we're going to be jumping into the limitations of Buchanan's Subjectivist Ontology, a critique of normative individualism. So, in the essay, The Foundations of Normative Individualism, James Buchanan, who is a famous economist, offers a compelling critique of epistemic individualism, grounded in an ontological subjectivism that ties individual choices directly to their utility functions. While Buchanan's subjectivism provides an argument against slavery and paternalism, his framework fails to address the deeper issue of human dignity. So in this video, we're going to be examining the strengths and limitations of Buchanan's subjectivist ontology and contrasting it with alternative approaches such as those of Frédéric Bastiat, Adam Smith, and Russell Kirk. And all of these who ground individualism in a higher order principle. So let's start off. Buchanan critique of epistemic individualism. So Buchanan rejects epistemic individualism, which justifies social arrangements based on the assumption of unequal epistemic foundations among individuals. He's going to argue that individuals must be treated as responsible for their own choices, irrespective of their epistemic position, avoiding any hierarchical classification that could justify systems like slavery. Buchanan's going to posit that choice and utility are inseparable and that no external criteria can classify choices as correct or incorrect. So let's define subjectivist ontology and epistemic individualism because these are important to clarify. These two key concepts at the heart of his critique: subjectivist ontology and epistemic individualism. So subjectivist ontology, as Buchanan conceives it, centers on the idea that the individual choices and preferences are inseparable, and that in these choices, they can't be evaluated by an external standard of correctness or optimality. So in this view, reality is subjective, with individual experiences and contexts shaping every decision made. There is no abstract utility function that can be observed independently of the choices themselves. So let's talk about epistemic individualism. So this assumes that each individual operates based on their unique epistemic foundation, their personal store of knowledge, beliefs, and reasoning processes. And so this leads to the assumption that every individual choice is a result of conscious and rational weighing of all available knowledge. Further, we can also state that this assumes an individual is making a choice and has applied a full range of knowledge available to them. So each choice in this model is seen as the outcome of an individual's best effort to maximize their utility or well-being based on the information at hand. So Buchanan rejects this epistemic foundation, arguing that it creates a false presumption of epistemic privilege, suggesting that an external observer could declare whether a choice was correct or incorrect based on its apparent alignment with optimal utility. So, to quote, the individual chooses that which he chooses, and their need exists neither prior nor posterior to knowledge that enables any choice to be classified as correct or incorrect against some criterion of well-being. At the moment of choice itself, the individual selects the alternative that is preferred, but this tautological proposition embodies no presumption about epistemic privilege. So Buchanan's argument here emphasizes the fundamentally subjective nature of choice. His ontological stance asserts that an individual's decision in any given moment is not subject to external critique or validation based on some abstract, correct criterion of well-being. The individual simply chooses the option they prefer, and at that moment is the most valid choice for them. So let's highlight the importance of this critique. External observers may argue that a person's choice is optimal, pointing to feelings of regret or outcomes that don't align with the individual's best interest. However, Buchanan's going to argue that these outside judgments, they're irrelevant because they fail to account for the unique contextual factors influencing the choice. The reasons for making the particular decision can be complex and varied, including personal biases, heuristics, ideological influences, and incomplete information. Additionally, we have things like modern behavioral economics that tend to support his position by demonstrating that individuals often rely on heuristics and biases that deviate from our rational decision-making processes. And so we have ideologies, worldviews, all of these play a significant role in shaping choices. They provide mental shortcuts that preclude the need for full deliberation on most of the choices that we make in our day-to-day life. Buchanan's subjectivist ontology acknowledges the inherent unpredictability of outcomes. So, unintended consequences, which cannot be fully known or accounted for in the decision making process, mean that even the best informed choice may lead to regret or unforeseen results. So, in short, Buchanan's rejection of epistemic individualism is built on the recognition that individuals do not and cannot operate with complete information or full rationality. Instead, choices are shaped by a myriad of factors unique to the individual's context and cannot be objectively evaluated against external standards of correctness or utility maximization. So let's look at the foundations here. He further asserts that knowledge does not extend to future choices because those choices create new conditions that cannot be predicted. Buchanan's rejection of epistemic criteria is rooted in his belief that choices are temporally bound and path dependent with no external authority able to declare a choice wrong. Ontology is the study of being, and Buchanan's subjectivist ontology positions the study of being as inherently subjective. For Buchanan, this means that reality itself is experienced and understood through the subjective lens of the individual. While this position might be confused with solipsism, the idea here is that only one's mind is sure to exist, and it doesn't necessarily need to be taken to that extreme, right? This is Cartesian to the nth degree. So, the rejection of epistemic individualism is important in understanding Buchanan's rejection of traditional utility models. Many economists assume that individuals make optimal choices based on their preferences and constraints. But how do we determine what constitutes an optimal choice if preferences are simply a reflection of an individual's prior experiences? Some economists, for instance, reject the idea of focusing on preferences altogether, instead, concentrating only on budget constraints. And the argument's fairly simple for this, right? Everyone fundamentally wants the best of everything, but they are limited by what they can afford. So, in this view, preferences are arbitrary and largely irrelevant to our actual day to day decision making. So, to illustrate the choice architecture of ontological subjectivism, consider this example choosing between different types of ground beef at a grocery store. Economically, the choice between 85/15 and 80/20 ground beef are pretty trivial, but it highlights how individual experiences shape preferences. If someone grew up in a household where 85/15 was always used, they may develop a preference for it, or perhaps they've come to dislike it based on those experiences. The point is that these preferences are tied to the individual's past experiences, and the choice made at the grocery store is a reflection of that path dependency. At the moment of the decision, the choice is temporally bound, specific to that moment, and shaped by the cumulative experiences that led to it. So, Buchanan's subjectivism also underscores the temporality of choices. A choice made at one point in time, we'll call this T1, is specific to that moment and is influenced by past experiences. Path dependency suggests that decisions individuals make throughout their lives create a chain of influence shaping future choices. The decision to choose 85/15 ground beef at the grocery store, as the example was given, is shaped by our past exposure to that specific type, and experience informs future grocery decisions. However, Buchanan would argue that no external observer can declare that the choice of ground beef is objectively right or wrong, even if a chef were to argue that 85/15 is optimal for making spaghetti due to its fat content, enhancing the flavor, and all of that. Buchanan's subjectivist perspective would suggest that the choice is still subjective. Another individual might prefer the taste of 93.7, this leaner ground beef. Thus, decisions may seem objectively better to one person, are still ultimately subjective based on the individual's unique experiences and circumstances. This leads to Buchanan's central claim. There is no objective criterion by which a choice can be declared right or wrong. While transcendental or moral arguments could potentially ground ethical decisions in objective or formal reality, Buchanan will argue that everyday decisions, such as choosing ground beef, are not subject to judgments. Choices in his framework are personal, contextual, temporally bound, and it is impossible to apply external standards to these decisions without overlooking the individuality of each person's experiences and preferences. Now, while Buchanan argument's internally consistent, it overlooks the role of anticipatory dynamics, where expectations about the future influence current decisions. If we look at the work of Loet Ladisdorff, working on circular causation, we're going to see that future states indeed shape present actions. And this is going to be a contradiction to Buchanan's claim that each choice is independent of future conditions. We're going to argue that knowledge can extend to the unknowable because potential future states exist as probabilities, and these probabilities inform present decision making. One of the central claims, again, that he makes is choices are personal, contextual, and temporally bound. Now, let's look at this idea of anticipatory dynamics. How can something in the future influence the present? Well, we have a compelling answer here. Anticipatory dynamics refer to the idea that our expectations of future events actively shape our current decisions. We can think of this in simple terms. If I believe that a recession is likely to occur next year, I will start making decisions today that reflect that belief. For instance, I might save some more money or stock up on non perishable goods like canned foods or dried goods. This demonstrates how a future possibility, the potentiality for a recession, affects my current decision making processes. Therefore, we can say future states, even if they have not yet occurred, play a significant role in the decisions we make today. So, in this sense, our future expectations become part of our decision making processes in the present. Now, this complicates his claims because choices are only temporally bound in his model. But if we accept that people often think of terms in the past, present, and future simultaneously, then these ideas that choices are only bound to the present become less tenable. Now, let's think of something wild. Let's jump to this. If we take this to its logical conclusion, if our future expectations influence our personal choices at the present time, then the future self can serve as an external observer to the present self. Buchanan argues that choices cannot be evaluated by an external criterion, but what if the future self, who will experience the consequences of present choices, can provide such a criterion? In this framework, the future self serves as a kind of external standard that can assess whether the present choice is good or bad based on the probabilities of those future outcomes. For example, consider someone who knows that smoking crack is harmful, but chooses to do it anyway. The future self, aware of this negative consequence, would clearly regard this as a poor choice. The future self and the self-awareness provides an objective lens through which to evaluate the present decision. While Buchanan rejects external standards for evaluating choices, this concept of anticipatory dynamics suggests that future self can indeed serve as an external observer, offering a more objective perspective on present decisions. And so this argument he presents hinges on the idea that the future state is entirely unknowable. But we would say the future state is not entirely unknowable, as it impacts and has a causative performance in our present actions. Thus, this challenges the strict subjectivity of Buchanan's framework. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into this ontological grounding. Let's look at his central criticism, right? He attempts to ground his subjective ontology against epistemic individualism, because epistemic individualism, if followed to its logical conclusion, leads to radical outcomes such as the justification of slavery or eugenics. And let's think about eugenics. This is the practice of improving the genetic quality of the population through selective breeding or genetic interventions. This is an extreme manifestation of treating people as objects for optimization rather than respecting their autonomy and dignity. Now, Buchanan recognizes the importance of avoiding such conclusions and attempts to provide a foundation of free choice that circumvents these ethical pitfalls. However, his ontological argument raises the question, is this truly a defense of free choice? Or is it merely an attempt to rationalize libertarianism while avoiding the ethical problems that come with it? Buchanan seems to walk this fine line, trying to preserve the libertarian principle of individual autonomy while also protecting against these more pernicious outcomes of radical individualism. Now, Buchanan himself recognizes the limitations of his own subjectivist ontology, particularly when it comes to grounding human dignity. He acknowledges that epistemic individualism struggles to draw clear ethical lines, as it allows external evaluators to declare what is best for others based on their own epistemic superiority. and that this opens the door for elitist claims and hierarchical divisions within society, potentially justifying oppressive practices like we've already discussed. Buchanan critiques the stance by arguing that subjectivist ontology is slightly better because it eliminates the need for an external evaluation of choices. In his words, to quote, "The burden of argument placed on the epistemic individualist in all such cases may be contrasted sharply with that of the subjectivist confronts. The latter can remain appropriately deaf and blind to the entreaties of the elitists who claim supra-individualist status. The biological dividing line that separates members of the human species from other animals is surely easier to draw than any within-species line that the epistemic defense of individuality must trace out. I am not suggesting that all problems of identification disappear, as the qualification for membership as individuals in the human species for the free exercise of choice cannot be met by children and the mentally incompetent. These problems seem, however, minuscule in comparison with those arrived at in the alternative framework." I'm sorry, I just don't buy that that's minuscule, but I get the sentiment of the argument. But in this passage, Buchanan claims that subjectivists can avoid the ethical dilemmas that plague epistemic individualists because there is no need to justify one's individual choices over another. He points to this biological distinction between humans and animals as a basis for human dignity, suggesting that this line is easier to draw than the complex epistemic qualifications that epistemic individualists must wrestle with. Now, here's where we have problems, right? Despite his claims, his subjectivist ontology leaves significant gaps in the argument for human autonomy and free choice. While he argues that individuals must be responsible for their own choices, that we cannot intervene to protect them from their own folly, this stance is difficult to justify on his own ontological grounds. The idea that human beings, by virtue of their membership in the human species, deserve free exercise of choice seems arbitrary. Buchanan himself acknowledges that children and mentally incompetent cannot fully exercise this freedom, yet he offers no concrete reasoning for why the rest of humankind should be granted the autonomy simply because they are not like the other animals. In essence, Buchanan's reliance on this biological distinction between humans and animals to ground this individual autonomy, it's insufficient. Just because humans possess some type of rationality and autonomy, this doesn't necessarily mean that they should be free from external constraints or intervention. This gap in Buchanan's reasoning raises the question of why we should privilege human choice in the absence of a clear ethical or ontological grounding. Buchanan's argument that the normative individualist must operate on the presumption that all individuals are responsible for their own choices and that we cannot protect them from their own poor decisions seems more like a concession than a solution. As Buchanan says here, to quote, "The normative individualist whose ontology is subjectivist operates on the presumption that, by their being as individuals, members of humankind are and must be treated as responsible for their own choices. Individuals are not to be protected from their own folly, even if this basic stance is tempered by ordinary compassion." The line of thinking assumes that there is no objective standard for determining what constitutes good or bad choices. Buchanan implies that because we do not have epistemic privilege over others, we cannot impose our judgments on their decisions. But this argument glosses over the deeper question of whether this radical subjectivism can truly justify human autonomy and dignity. If we cannot draw clear lines around who qualifies for free choice, as Buchanan himself acknowledges with the case of children and the mentally incompetent, then we have no solid ground onto which base our defense of autonomy on in general. If Buchanan's subjectivist ontology offers only a marginal improvement over epistemic individualism, as he admits, then it may be time to consider that a more grounded option. Buchanan's critique of epistemic individualism is valuable, but his subjectivism lacks the necessary ethical grounding to defend human dignity and autonomy fully. Instead, a more robust framework, perhaps one that incorporates higher order principles like natural law, moral sentiments, God, could provide the solid foundation for Buchanan's argument, which is missing. This would allow for a clearer articulation of why human beings deserve the free exercise of choice, not merely as a consequence of their rationality, but because of their inherent dignity as moral agents. So let's pop off with two favorite economists, Frédéric Bastiat and Adam Smith. They definitely provide a more robust foundation for this individualism by rooting it in natural law or divine order. Bastiat's individualism, based on sovereignty of individuals under God, allows for a recognition of human dignity that transcends subjective choice. Then we have Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. This is going to ground economic theory in the natural law of sentiments, which respects individual dignity while acknowledging human fallibility. These thinkers avoid this reductive trap of subjectivism by offering a higher order grounding. So let's look at those. I'm going to start with Adam Smith's work, particularly the theory of moral sentiments. This provides an answer to the fundamental problem of grounding human dignity in something more than solid subjective preferences. Smith's moral philosophy is rooted in natural law, and this concept is heavily influenced by his teacher, Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson's philosophy of common sense, this plays a crucial role in shaping Smith's thoughts on human nature and moral judgment. Hutcheson introduces the idea of moral sense. This is an innate ability to distinguish between good and bad actions independent of rational calculation. This moral sense, much like our physical senses, allows us to perceive actions as virtuous or vicious based on the feelings of approval or disapproval. While Smith later developed a more complex theory of moral judgment, grounding in the imaginative process of sympathy, he nonetheless retains the idea that human beings possess an inherent capacity for moral discernment. This capacity is not something that can be dismissed out of hand. It is a natural property of being human. Something to discuss here is that this is less well known from Smith, Hutcheson, etc., because they were fighting against Calvinists at the time, and that's why they don't do a lot of theological work and make it philosophical. But just know that I plan on doing a video that shows this theory of enlightenment from the Scottish people outside of Hume. Nobody cares about him anyway. It's very much a reaction to Calvinist theology. So the importance of this idea here is that it provides a grounding for human dignity that goes beyond the relativism of subjectivist ontology. If humans have an inherent ability to discern right from wrong, then any attempt to justify morally reprehensible actions like slavery or eugenics is negated by this internal moral mechanism. For Smith, human dignity is not something that needs to be justified through abstract arguments about choice or utility. It is embedded in our very nature as moral beings. This also explains why Smith, despite being an advocate for free markets, was never opposed to certain forms of redistribution. He just didn't want it abused by those unwilling to work, which I think we can all tend to agree with. While Smith grounds it in human dignity and natural law, Bastiat takes this argument a far step further by grounding it in the divine. Much like John Locke, Bastiat's defense of individual liberty and free choice rests on the belief that humans are made in the image of God. This theological grounding offers a stronger foundation for human dignity than any utilitarian or subjectivist justification. Bastiat's argument directly addressed the challenges posed by subjectivism, particularly when it comes to treatment of the mentally incompetent or children. While a utilitarian or subjectivist might argue that such individuals lack the capacity for rational choice and therefore do not deserve the same moral consideration, Bastiat's view is that all humans, regardless of their ability, have moral worth because they are the image bearers of God. This inherent dignity means that they cannot be excluded from the realm of free choice or human rights. Bastiat's writings on liberty are rooted in this theological foundation. In one of his famous passages, he argues, God has implanted in mankind also all that is necessary to enable it to accomplish its destinies. There is a providential social physiology, as well as a providential human physiology. The social organs are constituted so as to enable them to develop harmoniously in the grand air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers, away with their rings and their chains and their hooks and their pincers, away with their artificial methods, away with their social laboratories, their governmental whims, their centralization, their tariffs, their universities, their state religions, their inflationary or monopolizing banks, their limitations, their restrictions, their moralization, and their equalization by taxation. Now, libertarians and anarchists have abused this passage to absurdity, but Bastiat's point is a lot deeper than they're willing to give it. He's not advocating for abolition of government or authority. Rather, he is arguing that the government's role is to protect human liberty because humans are created in the image of God. Government should guard man from man, but it should not infringe upon the natural rights given by God unto man. Bastiat's arguments thus provide a clear moral boundary for individual choice. We are free to act as long as our actions do not violate the dignity of others as image bearers of God. So, both Smith and Bastiat offer a critique for Buchanan's subjectivism lacks. Smith's grounding in human dignity in the natural law provides this moral foundation for human autonomy, one that denies the justifications for slavery, eugenics, and other dehumanizing practices. Bastiat's theological grounding takes this further, suggesting that moral worth of individuals is not contingent upon their ability to make rational choices, but is instead rooted in their divine image. This view provides a solution to the problem of who qualifies for free choice. A problem Buchanan struggles with in this is his attempt to avoid elitist justifications for denying choice to certain individuals. Now, Bastiat's critique in particular is relevant to our modern discussions of freedom. Again, a lot of libertarians seek to justify their position through subjectivist, utilitarian, or epistemic frameworks, but this often leads to, actual incoherence or absurdity. I mean, we can look at this like an anarcho-capitalist meme. By ignoring these deeper moral and theological arguments made by thinkers like Bastiat, Locke, even Adam Smith, modern libertarians risk grounding their defense of liberty in a purely materialistic or utilitarian logic, which ultimately collapses under any type of scrutiny. As Bastiat and Smith both demonstrate, a true defense of liberty must be grounded in something transcendent, whether that be natural law or the divine image. So now we're going to kick off with our final critique. Russell Kirk's arguments against subjectivist ontology, although not directly, provide useful counterpoints to Buchanan's framework. Kirk's going to emphasize the importance of grounding human dignity in something beyond subjective experience. He's going to critique the notion that individual choice alone is sufficient to establish moral and political order. And we're also going to highlight this more robust, dignity-centered individualism that Buchanan subjectivism cannot support, right? So again, Russell Kirk, profound voice and conservative thought. Let's get to it. One of his recurring themes in his work is the importance of tradition as a moral and social foundation. In his words, to quote, "I did not love cold harmony and perfect regularity of organization. What I sought was variety, mystery, tradition, the venerable, the awful. I despised sophisters and calculators. I was groping for faith, honor, and prescriptive loyalties. I would have given any number of neoclassical pediments for one battered gargoyle." This quote reflects his deep disdain for the reduction of human life to these mathematical calculations and cold rationality. In many ways, this critique mirrors the shortcomings of both Buchanan's subjectivist ontology and epistemic individualism, both which emphasize autonomy of individual choice while ignoring the deeper roots of human existence: faith, honor, tradition, communality. For Kirk, the preservation of tradition is essential to protect society from the barren wasteland of unchecked subjectivism or this cold mathematical framework of modern intellectualism. Kirk's critique of intellectual arrogance and the rejection of tradition is evident in his reflections on reason. Even the wisest of mankind cannot live by reason alone. Pure, arrogant reason, denying the claims of prejudice, which commonly are also the claims of conscience, leads to a wasteland of withered hopes and crying loneliness, empty of God and man. The wilderness in which Satan tempted Christ was not more dreadful than the arid expanse of intellectual vanity, deprived of tradition and intuition, where modern man is tempted by his own pride. Here, Kirk argues that pure reason, when divorced from tradition and moral intuition, leads to spiritual desolation. This critique applies to Buchanan's subjectivist ontology and epistemic individualism, both which rely on the primacy of individual reason and choice without grounding those choices in a higher moral or traditional framework. Again, this is a powerful critique of our modern tendency to elevate subjectivity and reason above everything else. Kirk reminds us that human beings cannot thrive without tradition, which serves as a repository of collective wisdom and moral insight. Tradition, in this sense, acts as a restraint on the hubris of subjective choice, providing moral and a spiritual compass that goes beyond individual preferences and calculations. In the conservative mind, Kirk further develops the idea that history and tradition are not mere accidents, but are a part of a providential design. History often appears to resemble a roulette wheel. There is this truth in the old Greek idea of cycles, and round again may come the number which signifies a conservative order. The true conservative thinks of this process, which looks like chance or fate, as rather the providential operation of a moral law of polarity. Kirk's reference to history as the unfolding of a design offers stark contrast to the randomness and subjectivity proposed by Buchanan's ontology. While Buchanan's framework suggests that each individual choice is an isolated event, shaped solely by subjectivist preferences and temporally bound circumstances, Kirk argues that human history follows a moral law of polarity, guided by a providential force. For Kirk, the restoration of a conservative order is not just a matter of chance, but the result of understanding and reclaiming traditions and moral principles that have guided human societies for centuries. This fundamentally challenges the very foundation of subjectivist ontology, which dismisses external standards and traditions in favor of individual autonomy. So, to wrap up this part about Kirk, his reflections make it clear that tradition stands as a necessary principle prior to both subjective ontology and epistemic idealism. His insights offer a powerful critique of modern subjectivism and intellectual individualism. Tradition, as Kirk argues, should stand as the guiding principle that restrains human pride and provides the moral framework for individual choice. Without this foundation, human societies risk collapsing into the wasteland of intellectual vanity and unchecked will, a fate that Buchanan's framework, despite its intellectual rigor, cannot prevent. Tradition, rooted in faith, honor, and wisdom of the ages, is necessary as an antidote to the excesses of our modern subjectivism. So, to wrap this all up, Buchanan's ontological subjectivism, it offers a compelling critique of epistemic individualism, but ultimately fails to address the deeper issues of human dignity. By grounding individually solely in subjective choice, Buchanan creates a framework that cannot fully defend human worth or responsibility, particularly for those unable to exercise complete autonomy. In contrast, thinkers like Bastiat, Smith, and Kirk provide higher order grounding that recognizes individual dignity while respecting personal responsibility. Buchanan's subjectivism, while innovative, remains incomplete and requires further development to address these fundamental concerns. I am the Economancer. I hope you've enjoyed this, and it's a bit long. I look a little wild. It's been a while. Thank you for stopping in, and I hope you enjoyed this. God bless.